Let's talk about advisory boards versus governing boards. Essentially, in many ways, they're the same thing, except for one big difference. Governing boards have a fiduciary responsibility. And essentially, what a fiduciary does is ensure that the organization is doing what it's supposed to do. It's following the rules. It's aligning itself with its purpose. That its financial accounting is there's nothing, no malfeasance going on. It is oversight. Same thing with the leader, its role with leadership. It is providing oversight. Is the leader, is the executive, the president, the dean, engaged in what would be reasonable for that institution? Maybe it's not optimal, that's a different question, but whether it's reasonable given the conditions of the university or the organization, whether the financials are being spent towards its mission and vision, just whether all the boxes are checked. That's essentially the fiduciary role in governance. There are other roles for boards and advisors and trustees, but that is the one that makes a difference between whether it is a governance issue or whether it's just advisory. Now, the thing about fiduciary task is that they have to be done, and you can't have an institution that doesn't have some sort of a check and balance. But it's also, to put it bluntly, rather boring and dull. Essentially, in many ways, you can think of it's not too hard to think of a system of fiduciary responsibility where an institution would forego having a fiduciary altogether. You could outsource this to some sort of AI or something like that, because all you're really doing is having a predetermined set of criteria, and then you're trying to match that and see whether the institution is following those rules. It's a rule-checking procedure. Like I said, it provides legitimacy to the organization. However, it doesn't provide anything beyond that. And here's the problem. Because it's not all that interesting, because it's more of a task than an exploration or an inquiry, it can be really demotivating to be positioned all the time in this oversight place. Again, not that it's not important, it's just that it doesn't seem to deliver for a lot of trustees that mojo that'll help them be interested and engaged and active. And maybe that's even further of a problem. To spend so much time on fiduciary duties automatically takes your trustees away from being active and engaged. And I've even had an executive tell me that they were not interested in active and engaged trustees, which is shocking. It is a conception of trusteeship where a board is nothing but a hindrance or something to be managed, and that's a real crime, because obviously that's not the purpose of a governing board. But it's also such a waste. It's a resource waste. Perhaps some of the most important resource that a institution has is that expertise, that involvement, that participation, that engagement with some of their alumni, the most successful alumni that they have anywhere. These are people who are generally very, very successful in their private lives, and to sort of sideline them or put them only onto fiduciary work where they're only looking at reports that are pre-prepared and only looking at budgets that are pre-prepared and not doing that exploration work. Well, unfortunately, lots of institutions run out the clock. And they say, okay, well, we don't have any time for anything else. Thanks for coming. And that's it. So if you take that perfunctory task away, what is left is strategy and ideas. And at strategy and ideas, advisory boards and governing boards are exactly the same. The idea is that you have a group of really bright people who are going to explore issues. And the only way you can meaningfully explore issues is to be in the information flow, to be getting those same cues that staff are getting, that faculty are getting, that the executive's office is getting about how the institution is doing and what it's doing well. I want you to think about that, the idea that action creates strategy instead of strategy action. Too often we think that there is a one-to-one direction of you sit back, you think of a strategy, and then you operationalize that strategy. That's missing a key ingredient where governing boards and advisory boards can provide an awful lot of assistance in. There's a management by walking around. Well, there's also advising by walking around. And the first step to really engaging in meaningful ideas is to do some meaningful work, some meaningful action. And that requires a whole slew of different things that boards and board members can be involved in. Everywhere from visiting with constituents to exploring a class to walking the grounds, talking to faculty, talking to staff, talking to students. These are tasks that don't take a whole lot of time, but it's critical that advisors engage in them. And then once you have those experiences, then you can, before the strategy process begins, you can really contribute to the idea generation of the university. It's obvious that advisors are not professional members of their organization. They have all kinds of diverse talents. But it's not just that their talents are important. It is that they are representatives or potential representatives of the larger community. And you don't have to have any expertise to have that kind of experience and have that kind of a foresight. There's no ownership solely of anyone in an organization that doesn't allow multiple perspectives or shouldn't allow multiple perspectives. So those of you who are on advisory boards and those of you who are working with advisory boards, I want you to think of them as a critical resource in strategy and idea generation. And that's interesting. That's something that is meaningful and engaged and keeps your trustees and advisors active. It makes them, give them an actual purpose for being on the board. And that applies regardless of whether you're on a governing board or an advisory board. And frankly, it's a lot easier for an advisory board to be engaged in meaningful work with advisors and board members, because they don't have that burden of the fiduciary element. The fiduciary element is sort of like a necessary but not sufficient element of governance. And so in many ways, there's reason to celebrate those of you who are on advisory boards that you don't have that burden and that you can focus your energy or demand to focus your energy in areas that are interesting and generative and participatory rather than just providing oversight. So this is kind of a contrarian idea, but if you're going to have a successful board, regardless of governing or advisory, you need to be active, you need to be participatory, you need to be focused on strategy and ideas. And that's something that we're all capable of doing. And particularly those of you who are serving on these boards have a lifetime of experience that can add to that. And if it's not being allowed to flourish, if it's being managed, if you're being forced only into that fiduciary responsibility as the sum all of what you do, there's something wrong with what's going on. I know from my own experience that had a trustee, we called them national trustees. They were not voting trustees, which, by the way, a little aside, in my time working with the board, there were, I think, 2 votes over a decade that were contested. And when I say contested, it's simply 1 vote, not in support. One was simply a trustee wanted to make a signal to the larger community that were taking tuition seriously, and they wanted to send the message that they had heard some of those concerns along those lines. And another one simply didn't believe that the action was necessary, and but there were only one vote. And even that one no vote caused an enormous amount of uproar among the staff. It was just sort of unheard of to do so. So anyway, back to my story about a trustee. He was a very prominent trustee, was a CEO for a Fortune 500 company, was very frustrated that they were not assigned a voting role. And I thought this was really peculiar because the votes are generally perfunctory, and a lot of those issues are worked out, whether to pull a resolution or not beforehand. They were very upset with this and eventually left the board, even though their contribution, their ideas, was probably some of the most important ideas that board had heard in my decade of service. So take advisory roles, whether you're on an advisory board or you're on a governing board, with an opportunity to provide advisement seriously, and try to find those ways, and not just try to find those ways to find meaningful work and meaningful action. All right, just my 2 cents. Take care.